reaction. Hi, my name is Greg Tormo. I'm here with my wife, Kiki Tormo, and we will be interviewing Darren Bradley, the architecture photographer extraordinaire who gave a symposium at this year's Tiki Oasis 2018. How did you get into photographing architecture, and why did you pick modernist architecture?
It started as a hobby, really. I was living in France, and when I moved back here in the 90s, started seeing a lot of the buildings around town in San Diego that I'd always kind of grown up with, and were getting demolished or modified beyond recognition. So I just started photographing them just for posterity, really, and more than anything before they'd get demolished. And then I was posting them, and eventually they just started getting published. And so the one thing led to another, and eventually I just started getting commissions to take photos of buildings, and still do it for fun, but now it's more of a job at the same time, so which is not a bad thing.
Do you have any suggestions for someone who wants to, I wouldn't say imitate you, but who's interested in architecture photography and wants to make the most of what they can do?
Well, I like to say that I don't photograph the building, I photograph how I feel being in the building. So it is much more of an emotional reaction. I mean, yes, there are techniques that you need to understand as far as keeping lines straight, for example, and knowing what time of day. Buildings change completely. Even though everyone says, well, it's not like photographing a person because they can't complain they don't like the photo, but at the same time, they do have personalities, and they do look differently throughout the day, and depending on the time of day, and also whether it's cloudy that day or sunny. And so watching the building and letting it speak to you, and letting the architect's message, because every building kind of has at least one message that the architect was trying to convey with that building. So understanding what that is, and then finding the best way to photograph it to really emphasize that one clear message is probably the best way to go. I know that's not that clear, but
no. But what's coming across to me is you have a passion for this.
Definitely.
And what I like about modernist architecture is that it speaks to me also.
Well, I wanted to say, speaking of emotional reactions, why do you think there's now such a strong interest in mid-century modernist, brutalist architecture? Some of these buildings were languishing. We live in Palm Springs, and now the market is so hot, everybody wants a modernist house. Greg's at the Paul Kaplan Group, and there's only a limited, amount of supply, and people are coming from all over the world and finally really appreciating this architecture. I mean, what do you think it has grabbed everybody's attention?
Speaking about myself personally, it's because it's the architecture that I grew up with, but also it speaks, I think once you've lived in a modernist house or you've experienced modernist architecture, the simplicity of it, the clean lines, the indoor-outdoor experience, the glass, the light, you don't get that in a conventional house. And most houses these days are really just built like boxes with holes punched in them, instead of really, just the older mid-century modern houses are essentially not much more than tents, wooden tents in some cases, or lean-tos, really, and that connection to the outdoors and your environment and the way you flow through the space. I think people are missing that. And if you notice commercials on TV for everything from soap to cars, they always use mid-century modern houses in the background. And I think that speaks to the fact that they're just so clean and easy on the eye and easy to understand, and there's a certain calmness about them that you don't see in a lot of other types of houses.
Well, the focus becomes what's in the house, not necessarily the house itself.
Right, about collecting objects, right, which speaks to the materialism of society. But I think people kind of reject that in some ways. I mean, not everybody does, obviously, and some people just don't get it. But when you do, when you get the bug, you can't go back.
I agree with that. Now, what were you going to say?
Well, I was going to say what you do by photographing these beautiful commercial and residential buildings is you are helping towards the preservation of them, because not everyone has them on their radar. And then once you see a really good photograph, then you want to go out and explore and see them for yourself. And then maybe people get involved.
And not every city is as preservation minded as, say, Palm Springs.
That's certainly
San
right.
Diego. Can you speak to how San Diego treats these buildings?
They have a mixed record, I would say. In some cases, when it's convenient to be preservation-minded, they are. When you can make a strong commercial, economic case for it. Otherwise, frankly, a lot of buildings get swept under the rug and go the way of demolition in the middle of the night. Just for economic reasons.
Do you think that's the same as for both commercial as well as residential buildings, or
Absolutely. Yeah, it goes in both directions, definitely. And then the question is always, especially in the United States, well, what era do you preserve? Is it just the mid-century, or the mid-century period? Frankly, they weren't that sensitive either to preservation, so they were often demolishing Victorian buildings or Spanish-era colonial buildings to build their mid-century office buildings. So, which one do you preserve in that case? So I can see the argument there. Frankly, it's a little ironic that we're advocating to preserve mid-century modern buildings when in the mid-century period they were not at all preservation-minded about anything that had happened before. But I still try, and you're absolutely right about photographing. That really is my main goal, is to try to get people to stop and notice and hopefully appreciate buildings that they might otherwise just drive by every day or walk by every day without even noticing. And oftentimes I get that comment that when I take a photo of a building and I'll show it to somebody who should be familiar with it, and they'll say, well, I've never seen that building before. And I'll say, well, you've worked in this office right across the street from it for the past 20 years.
Well, I have to say, because you photographed a house that we owned, what you do is you showcase that house. Sometimes it's not apparent to the average person looking at your photo that there may be other things around it that aren't quite as photogenic as that particular house, as was the case with the neighborhood that we had our house in. But it was a beautiful William Kreisel house that you photographed. But you brought up a point earlier that where you said people they don't necessarily appreciate these buildings, or they're not noticing these buildings. Do you think that there are some sins being committed against this architecture that sort of takes away from how attractive they might be if they'd been taken better care of?
Absolutely. Even a paint job, you'd be surprised how just repainting it in more traditional color, in the colors that it was originally intended, or removing some of the gaudy signage that's gone up on a building over the years. And oftentimes, when I'm photographing a building, I try not to modify them. Obviously, I don't do much in Photoshop or anything to these buildings. But what I'll do is just some light touch-up, or I'll remove the bad sign that's on the side of the building or something in Photoshop, and that itself just transforms the building. So a lot of times it wouldn't really take much to restore them, or at least get them to where people would appreciate them a lot more if people would just remove the layers of crap basically that have accumulated on them over the years.
Tell us about your new book. You do a lot of traveling. You did a West Coast book. Now you have an East Coast book coming out.
Yeah, with Fiden and my friend and partner Sam Lubell, we did a West Coast last year, mid-century modern travel guide, basically. So we basically traveled from the Mexican border to the Canadian border, and we just with each city is by chapter, and we've got about 260 projects in there.
Are there favorite buildings or structures that you would like to highlight from that book?
It's tough to say. I mean, in general, I appreciate the stuff that's a little less known. I like to try to find the hidden treasures that are kind of off the beaten path.
Yeah, look for the things that nobody else has.
Yeah, exactly. Everybody loves Neutra stuff, but I want to find maybe the commercial strip mall that nobody's seen before, and that you don't even know who the architect is. And I love stuff like that. So we did the same thing for the East Coast this year, and actually all last summer I spent several trips going up and down the East Coast with my friend Sam Lubell, and that book is coming out next month. So.
Any plans for an international book?
Yeah, we've got a couple in the works. I work in Australia off and on, and so I've got a lot of photos there that I'd love to turn into something. And then also Europe. I've lived in Europe as well, in France, and I'm very familiar with it. So we'd love to do something in France, the UK, Australia. So, yeah.
Modernist architecture encompasses a lot of different sub-styles, as it were. We're at a Tiki event right now. Tell us about some of the Tiki architecture, and how do you think that fits into the modernist ethos?
Tiki architecture is really kind of a combination of traditional Polynesian architecture and Googie architecture, if you're familiar with that. So the sort of the space age optimism, the crazy angles, and the from the atomic era, from the post-war era, you saw in a lot of diners and some apartment buildings and things like that. If you combine that with already Polynesian architecture with the big A-frames and the prows and the post and beam, a lot of that already goes hand in hand. So it wasn't that difficult to come up with lava rock walls instead of flagstone walls, for example, and do a lot of. So there's a lot of commonality there.
This particular area, San Diego, has quite a lot of that.
Sure.
Shelter Island. Are there particular architects that built these things that you think deserve recognition?
Yeah, so Robert Platt did a lot of the buildings. He was an architect on Shelter Island, actually, and he did a lot of the tiki buildings in that little tiki colony there. A-frame inspired buildings, things like that. Armand Davis did some buildings. They designed a lot of the Denny's franchise, but again with the Googie style from the old Denny's, and they also did like Humphreys and some of those buildings there. They certainly deserve credit for that. I think those are some of the big ones. There's a lot of other local architects that have done, like Lloyd Rocco and stuff, have done kind of organic modern, which is kind of evokes tiki sometimes, or some of the churches around, the mid-century modern churches like the Robert Deslauriers did, which have kind of a tiki vibe to them as well.
Is Wildwood, New Jersey in the East Coast book? We love the Googie motels there.
Yes, I visited it. I've only been there once, and I was there on the off season, which is an interesting time to go because all the motels are shuttered and it's kind of a ghost town. No one's there. Yeah, it is.
There they call it doo-wop architecture. That's the term for what they call Googie over here.
I think is a dumb term personally, but I think it should just be called Googie. But what do I know?
That term isn't. I don't think it's that well known over there.
No,
yeah. I'd like to thank Darren Bradley for joining Kiki and myself, Greg Tormo, here on Tiki Oasis TV.